Oh. We're live, yeah? Okay. Sorry about that. Just a bit of wardrobe going on in the background. So thank you for joining us on this special edition of Pan-African Attitude. It's a bit different today. We're not talking exclusively about something that's happening in Africa, but we are talking about something that is related to Africa, and that is the takeover of Syria by the Islamist terrorist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, designated terrorist group in the UK, the US, and by the UN, but somehow has been paraded as the liberators of Syria. Now, the reason why we're talking about this today is because we see a lot of parallels between what's going on in Syria and what's going on in the US and what's happened in the past in Libya. And we're going to talk about some of those parallels with the co-hosts that are sitting with me here in the studio in Nairobi, and the co-host that is joining us from the heart of revolutionary struggle in Burkina Faso. But before we do that, there's this very interesting video from 2008 where someone who knows all about regime change operations was trying to warn other Arab League officials that their end could be near. Let's play the video, please, Oyo.
يد عربية بالكامل تقتل تشنق في المشانق مع نتفرج لماذا؟ ما ممكن الدور جاي عليكم كلكم. نعم. ليش ما يكون فيها تحقيق في مقتل صدام حسين؟ ليش أمريكا قاتلت مع صدام حسين ضد الخميني؟ كان صديقها. تشيني كان صديق لصدام حسين. رامسفيلد كان وزير دفاع الامريكا لما كان يدمروا في العراق، صديق حميم لصدام حسين، واخيرا باعوه وشنقوه. حتى انتم اصدقاء امريكا، نحن اصدقاء امريكا، بلاش نقول انتم، نحن اصدقاء امريكا كلنا قد توافق امريكا على شنقنا في يوم ما.
Okay, as you can see from the video, Muammar Gaddafi is trying to warn the Arab leaders, and none other than Bashar al-Assad is laughing it off. I hate to say this, but I don't think he's laughing now. And I hope that, you know, we as Africans can not only learn from the mistakes that we've made in our past, but learn from the mistakes that others have made. One of the things that people are discussing quite heavily online, and I'll bring it to you, William, is that you can't rely on any external power for your own security. Yeah. Some people are saying that the Russians might have betrayed Bashar al-Assad, even though he's currently in Moscow, that they were too engaged with what was going on in Ukraine. Some say the Iranians betrayed Bashar al-Assad, or maybe they were too engaged with what's going on in their own country. Who knows? Who knows? Only those behind the scenes will know. But what we do know is that it's very difficult to rely on the security of your own state on other states, in some cases, in the case of Russia, which are thousands and thousands of miles away. What do you want to say about that?
I think definitely that lack of a strong military force, a strong military institution to safeguard Syrians has played a part in the fall of Assad's government. And, you know, we've had people, as you said, you know, say the Russians betrayed them, the Iranians did that, maybe it's Hezbollah. But I don't really think that's the case, because as the, you know, offensive started, we saw the Russians provide air support and all that. But on the other side, we had the Syrian military literally get rid of their uniforms and get, you know, in civilian. So ultimately, it's a question of, if you don't fight for your country, do you expect the Iranians to come and do it for you? Do you expect the Russians to come and do it for you? But at the same time, there also could be the wider argument as to what led Syria to be in this destabilized state, because there's the element of the military was not getting paid enough. And if you look at that, you also have to consider that Syria itself has been under a third of Syria is occupied by the Americans. They steal the oil, they steal the wheat. These are resources which could have maybe gone into officers' salaries and building strong institutions. So I think there's many moving parts to it, but the fact that Syria did not have a strong institution, be it a military one or otherwise, that played a huge part in it. And alongside that, the role the Americans played in this being the reality also has to come into question, because even for Jolani himself, he used to be in ISIS, and ISIS itself could not exist in its present form if it
Yeah.
wasn't for the Americans. So yeah.
I think you might be being a bit harsh on the military. 90,000 Syrian men have given their lives fighting for the Syrian army. So it's not like, and this wouldn't just start yesterday.
Yeah, it's been
Started
13
13 years ago. Plus, there's
Yeah.
the sanctions that were imposed.
Yeah.
Plus, there was the was it the earthquake that happened?
Oh yeah, those the earthquake
And
as well.
all the international humanitarian organizations basically gave aid to Turkey and
Yeah,
zero
just
to Syria. So this is
yeah.
this has been what I'd call death by a thousand
Cuts,
cuts,
I agree. Yeah.
and a long war of attrition. Um, but but what I'm hopeful for in terms of the Sahel is all of these three revolutionary countries are in exactly the same situation. They're all come through military coups, revolutionary military coups, all Muslim majority countries, all neighboring countries, all have taken the same steps. Niger's gone one further with kicking out the Americans too, but all three of them have taken the same steps in kicking out the French. So I'm a bit more hopeful that that it would be a bit more difficult to do what's happened in Syria in the AES. And let me bring in my sister Inam. What do you think, Inam? Do you think that what's happened in Syria is it less likely to happen in the AES, or do you think we shouldn't be so optimistic?
Well, to begin with, I mean, I want to start by just stating that it's tragic to be seeing what's happening in Syria right now. I mean, I feel like sometimes we hear about these things and we think of, like, a place that maybe for some people is far off or distant. But there's a lot of parallels, like you've already brought up, with what happened between Syria and what happened in Libya. And so to be seeing something like this play out again on the world stage, it's just tragic. And I feel very deeply for the people who are living through, a potential period of insecurity because of what's going on. I don't think that what's happening in Syria is necessarily impossible or couldn't happen in the AES, but I don't think it could happen anytime soon. And I think a big part of that is because the imperialist forces, even though they try very hard to play this divide and conquer game everywhere, at this moment, there's too much popular support for the Alliance of Sahel states, both within the region and then also on an international level. They haven't really been able to properly tarnish the reputation of the three leaders of the AES. Even though they try, I still think that if they were to try to whether through these sort of proxy forces or through more of the Libya type of invasion, I think it would just go off extremely unpopular right now, both internally and externally. So I don't think that they have been able to properly manufacture consent for this kind of thing. Unfortunately, in Syria, to some extent, they have been able to manufacture consent. They've been able to, depict a certain image of the power that was in place, and so it's like how it happened in Libya, where people are saying that this is a great thing, the dictatorship has fallen, et cetera, not really looking at what this is going to mean in the long term for the country, for the entire region. I think it wasn't something that they did in one day. It took years of manufacturing consent, of spreading a certain narrative, of pushing the narrative, finding people to prop this narrative up on all sorts of media platforms. I don't think they've done this with the Sahel yet, but I don't think it means that 10 years from now they're not going to keep trying little by little, which is why I think it's so important to have platforms like African Stream that push back very, very hard against maybe the narrative that some of the more imperialist forces would prefer.
Thank you. I was thinking about Jake Sullivan and the email he sent to Hillary Clinton, February 2012, which was then leaked on WikiLeaks, where he says, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. And then it reminded me again of Captain Ibrahim Traore. He did an interview with Burkina Bay-based journalist where he was saying, we tried to have an open and honest relationship with France with regarding this terrorism problem. But we soon realized not only were they not helping, but quite the opposite. We saw evidence that they were giving logistical and material support to the terrorists. So I guess my question to you, Kenneth, this whole war on terror, it used to be very controversial to say that these terrorists are backed by Western states. Do you think in 2024 that's still controversial, or do you think it's indisputable at this stage?
Well, I think they're really trying hard to sanitize and whitewash the terrorists. And Syria is a very good example because the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has rebranded several times. And just about 6 years ago, the State Department had added them to their list of foreign terrorist organizations. And one nonprofit in Washington actually had this to say about it, just an update, last year, August, that the group has made extensive attempts at framing itself as a moderate force worthy of international support and is unlikely to undermine those efforts intentionally. Just listen to that.
Yeah.
These are the same guys who are chopping people's heads off and committing all kinds of atrocities when the Syrian war broke out in 2011. And now, just over a decade later, they're trying to present them as a moderate force that needs international backing. So it's very clear that the West now has dropped any pretense of democracy when it comes to the war on terror. They will back and support any group that is aligned with their agenda. Look, these guys have clearly wanted to remove Assad from power, and it's very convenient to whitewash them and present them as this force that has reformed and has cleaned up the acts, and they're going to bring democracy. And the same needs to be, we need to be aware about it in the AES, because they've clearly not given up on the AES. They will try and present groups that want to bring chaos as these reformist groups that want to establish democracy. So we have to be very aware at attempts to whitewash terrorist groups. And just something else, the whole reason why the West was very invested in the north of Africa was supposedly to fight terrorism. And in about 20 years, the levels of terrorism increased by about 100,000%.
Yeah.
We just had like 9 deaths reported in 2002. And just a few years later, we were talking of thousands of deaths.
Yeah, I think it was 8,000 or something.
8,000 thereabout, yeah.
Yeah.
So it just tells you the whole thing is cooked up to give the West a reason to come in and do their thing.
And I also find it interesting how whenever you find these terrorist groups, the West almost always sees close by. If you look at al-Qaeda, if you look at the Taliban, if you look at ISIS, if you look in Africa at al-Shabaab, if you go to the Sahel, every single time the West moves in, suddenly terrorism comes from behind. And I think with regard to the Sahel, this could also have to do with the whole plan to balkanize. For example, northern Mali, with the whole Azawad, what's the word I'm looking for? Split, with the whole Azawad trying to split from the Mali state. And, the role European media gives these very problematic figures who, kill hundreds of villagers in Africa. they'd never do the same if it was happening to them. If it was, the Manchester bomber, like, yeah, I mean, we understand what you did was pretty messed up, but it's good we also give you a platform for you to share with us why you did what you did. So I think it's significant that wherever terrorism is today, the West seems to follow. And it's also insignificant in as the West tries to portray itself as, if you need to deal with the terror problem, you need to call us. The whole reason, for example, they went into Iraq was to deal with terrorism. The whole reason they're in Africa with AFRICOM is to deal with terrorism. But they're the very, very same people who bring this problem. So how do you trust the same person who burnt the house to put out the fire?
Mm.
Yeah.
Sure.
And they're clearly not an indigenous fighting group just inspired by Islam, because as a Muslim, I can tell you universally amongst all Muslims, everyone thinks our greatest enemy would be the state of Israel. Yeah.
Mm.
Not only have they never attacked Israel, but the Al Nusra fighters, which has now been rebranded,
Yeah.
which was started by Jelani. So it's an interesting history. So Jelani was sent to Syria by none other than al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS.
Yeah.
So he led Daesh in Syria, and then he official face of Qaeda in Syria. So the most two extreme terrorist groups you could think of. This guy has been the leader of the fighting forces of both of these groups.
Yeah.
But anyway, what I was saying is, not only have they never attacked Israel, they've been treated by Israelis in Israeli hospitals. Why would a usurper, occupier, settler, colonial, expansionist entity treat fighters of a so-called Islamist fighting group if they, unless they knew that these guys were supported by the same people that Israel is supported by? That's
Same
number one.
interest, Yeah.
Secondly, not only have they not attacked Israel, they've actually attacked Palestinians.
Yeah.
So if we remember,
Hamas.
in 2016, these one of these rebel groups, which is part of the coalition that Jelani leads, they beheaded a 12-year-old boy on camera. You remember that story?
Yeah.
So how the Muslim community, and a lot of Muslims are supporting this, there's been footages of people celebrating all over the world from Malaysia. How they can support this, I do not know. I honestly do not know.
It reminds me of Gaddafi. When Gaddafi fell, there were very, very many people who were like out, finally the dictator is gone, the dictator is gone. But let's remember, this is now a country that went from providing very accessible healthcare, education, energy to its people. Now it's a broken state. It's a failed state. You have two groups fighting over control of the country's oil. The structure, because at some point, apparently, Gaddafi used to even send aid to countries affected by natural disasters. You'd never think of that. I mean, last year, Libya, a dam collapsed because of that instability, that destabilization attempt. So it might or it will show in due time, but I think it's unfortunate to just celebrate, the fall of Assad just because Assad fell. I mean, who are you replacing him with? Is it the guy who was literally beheading, children?
Exactly.
Yeah.
There were actually already signs that these guys were up to no good. I remember when the civil war was really at its peak, and we had this very historic site in Palmyra in Syria. In Syria, we must remember, is one of the oldest civilizations on earth.
Yeah.
Also, one of the places where Christianity actually started in Damascus. One of the oldest centers of Christianity, Islam, all these places, very cosmopolitan, very urbane, really the bedrock of civilization.
Yeah.
And these guys went to Palmyra and they were smashing up ancient historical artifacts, and everyone in UNESCO was not believing that these are the same guys that we are supporting to bring down Assad, and they have no respect for history, for anything.
And that's the same thing they do in Mali.
Yeah,
So
Timbuktu.
Mali,
Yeah,
they go to Timbuktu
Yeah.
because they have a warped version of Islam, which thinks that anything that predates Islam is somehow haram or shirk.
Yeah.
So they go and destroy it. And it's this is basically, they want to keep us occupied. They want to keep us occupied in the Sahel with internal issues, and they want to keep the people occupied in West Asia, what many people call the Middle East. Because if you're occupied fighting a Takfiri terrorist groups that's taking Yazidi women as slaves, that's slaughtering Christians, that's killing Shias, that's doing all these types of stuff, then you're never going to unite and overthrow the settler colony in your neighborhood. If you're having to fight a terrorist problem in Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger, then I was going to say you're never going to kick out the mining companies, but fortunately
despite
for us,
everything,
fortunately for us in the AES, they managed to do both. But that's the plan. Their plan is to keep us occupied so that we don't focus on the neo-colonial structures, the extraction of resources, the extraction of wealth. We've talked a little bit about Israel. You know, some people think we might be jumping into conspiracy theories and all that, but actually, you know, let's hear it straight from the horse's mouth. Got a video of Netanyahu celebrating this Takfiri terrorist group overthrowing Bashar al-Assad. Let's play it.
The collapse of the Assad regime, the tyranny in Damascus, offers great opportunity, but also is fraught with significant dangers. This collapse is a direct result of our forceful action against Hezbollah and Iran, Assad's main supporters. It set off a chain reaction of all those who want to free themselves from this tyranny and its oppression.
Okay, so straight from the horse's mouth, the timing of this, the rebel advance. Let's not forget, from when the militant groups was announcing an advance to Bashar al-Assad falling, I think it was like 3-4 days. There's no way a bunch of guys with just AK-47 could do this without logistical intelligence, air support from major powers, not only in the region but also in the world. And again, that speaks to what we mentioned in the Sahel. And then it also started just as Hezbollah signed a ceasefire agreement. So this is, and let's talk about why. You know, we're not here to romanticize Bashar al-Assad or paint him as anything. You know, it's up to the Syrian people to decide their future, and if they didn't want Assad, that's up to them. But this isn't about just removing him because of perceived dictatorship. This is about destroying the resistance axis, because the triangle of Iran using Syria to supply weapons to Hezbollah was very effective in deterring Israel. Until this recent invasion, Israel got kicked out of Lebanon, or most of Lebanon, in 2006, lost the war in 2000, and saw Lebanon as somewhere where they couldn't really flex their muscles. And that's because of the role of Syria
later on,
in that. Now that's over, it means that Hezbollah is more isolated. The resistance axis is more isolated. And Gaza, the people of Gaza, are more isolated now than they've ever been. And this is what it's about. So I just can't understand how people who claim to support the Palestinian cause are cheerleading the breakup of the only small resistance there is towards Israeli aggression in the region. That's just me.
I mean, Syria was literally one of the few Arab states that took a stance against Zionism, and they paid for it heavily. So for countries like, you know, the Turks, the Saudis, for them to come and do this, I think it also betrays a form of short-sightedness, because what happens once Israel is done with Lebanon, Israel is done with Syria, in the end, it's an expansionist settler colony. The plan for Greater Israel still exists.
It's in motion right now.
So once
as soon as news was out that Assad had left Syria,
tanks were already
past the Golan Heights, creating a buffer zone, which is just military language for occupation zone. So now they're occupying more of Syria than they did since 1967. And yet people are cheering. I'm going to come back to, sorry, if there's anything else you want to say?
No.
I want to come back to Inam, we mentioned it earlier. There's a lot of criticism. I'm not sure if I want to join in on that. It's just because who knows what's going on behind the scene. But there's a lot of criticism of Russia. Russia betrayed Assad. Do you think in the Sahel there'll be any concern because there is so much security partnership with Russia? Do you think there'll be any concern about what's happened in Syria and how, if the right deal is pushed, that Russia could potentially
Macron, yeah, have at it.
Yeah, it could turn its back on the Sahel. What do you think, Inam?
Well, I think we have to look at the position that the Sahel states are starting at and then what their long-term goals are. This is a period of time when the Alliance of Sahel states are trying to partner basically with any international body that's willing to respect their sovereignty, to be able to build up their own military capacity and ultimately work towards their own sovereignty in the long run, which is a lot of what this is, the AES project is about, both in terms of military defense and then general industrialization work, which go hand in hand. So I think because after so many generations of very strong French exploitation and neocolonialism, the reality is that the AES countries, like the rest of Africa, are somewhat dependent right now on international allies to be able to have, basically the support to build up their own sort of military supply and access to weapons, industrialization processes. In the long run, hopefully, these countries are able to move more quickly towards building up that capacity and having that sort of access to industrialization, so they don't have to rely on these partners and be dependent in that way. That really is the goal. So I think because of the way that's sort of being organized, if as long as these countries, not just Russia, but like Russia, as well as Iran and others, stay on this path for a long enough time, the AES won't be dependent, in X amount of years. But as of now, it is kind of like most African states, the AES is in a difficult position because after so many years of French neocolonialism, they've pretty much been left with like nothing. So they're depending on solidarity in the form of technology transfers in the short term to not have to rely then on this sort of support in the long term, if that makes sense. Hopefully that makes some sense.
No, it's a good answer. I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, which is probably impossible to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because let's not forget Libya. The Chinese and the Russians both had veto power over the so-called no-fly zone, which doesn't make any sense because NATO planes were flying. The NATO planes were flying and bombing. So this is potentially the second time that we've seen, when push comes to shove, the Russians might not have our best interest at heart. So we gotta ask ourselves. I know this is where we are at the moment, but how many years do you think it will take to get that kind of self-reliance and independence of our security measures? It's an impossible question, but just answer it to the best of your ability.
Well, I think to some extent it makes a lot of sense, right? Like we know that every country within the sphere of geopolitics is looking out for their own interests. It's just kind of how geopolitics functions and how it works. So I think that we can have solidarity and we can count on other countries to an extent. But I think also as Pan-Africanists, we know that ultimately Africa will be free when Africa gets to a place where we're unified. And I think we do have this context that was, mapped out for us by other people like Kwame Nkrumah, for example, Modibo Keita and others, who understood that ultimately, if Africa remains divided, we are dependent. And so I think the AES is because the AES has this goal of federation, of this closer unification, it's the closest that we might be able to get towards having that real sovereignty. But I do still think that even with the AES, if the AES is completely surrounded by neo-colonies around it, then also there's a question of, will that not be fragile? So I don't know exactly in terms of how many years it will take, but I do think that there's a larger project. There's a Pan-African project and objective that involves the continent at large as the ultimate solution in terms of how we get out of this mess. Because, you know, right now we are still just a bunch of small states who don't have power at the level of the UN, who don't have power within international institutions. Even the AES right now seems to not be qualified to join BRICS in the eyes of the BRICS countries. I mean, they've expressed an interest, but it doesn't seem like they were actually, I don't know if they were actually considered, but we know that they're not in BRICS or a BRICS partner right now. So I think that there's a lot of work in terms of actually fighting for this broader Pan-African project and this broader Pan-African vision. And I think the AES understands that as the ultimate goal. It might take a long time, but I do feel like there's going to be some level of dependence up until we get to that point.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry. I feel for the AES, I could be wrong, but the difference I see between them and Assad, for example, I see there's less of toxic dependency, if I can call it that. Like, yeah, for sure, you don't expect Burkina Faso or Mali right now to have the same amount of military muscle as France and those other countries. But it seems their approach is not that let's bring in the Russians to fight for us, but more of we recognize the Russians have this advantage in terms of technology. So how can we leverage them while we figure out how to like close the gap? I feel the defining feature for the AES for me is that self-sufficiency. Like, yes, we might use your stuff for now, but we don't want that to be the same arrangement in like 10 or maybe 5 years. I mean, remember Traore in Russia last year when Africa was offered grain as aid. He said, yeah, that's well and good, but what I'd like for me and the leaders here is that the next time we come here, we shouldn't come to collect aid. So I think that mentality is what permeates the rest of the AES in them.
Yeah. Let me just add to that. There's a video that went viral last week. I'm not sure when the video was from. It was Captain Ibrahim Traore. He was meeting with Russian delegates, including Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and he's got his gun in the holster.
Bro, he's strapped.
And the caption, I mean, the caption was probably a bit unfair, but the caption said, he doesn't trust none of these guys. So it was an interesting video. Obviously, the internet can be the internet, can take things out of context.
Yeah.
But in some ways, I hope that was the mentality.
Yes.
Like,
yes,
we're friends.
You can never be too sure.
We're friends. We're working together, but I'm keeping half an eye on you because, you know, our history has shown that Europeans can offer some support, but can't, you know, should always be kept.
When stuff hits the fan.
When stuff hits the fan, there should be always be a healthy amount of skepticism, skepticism.
Yeah.
Okay, so have you been surprised by, Kenneth? Have you been surprised by the media coverage? A little bit. You shared something. We've got a African Stream WhatsApp group. You shared something that I watched the interview. I did not notice at the time. In this CNN interview with Jelani, they put the pronouns
He, him.
he, him. He, him.
Yeah, I've seen that someone in one of the blogs.
I mean, nothing against pronouns.
Yeah,
I'm of the opinion. If you've got a pronoun,
but for Jolani though,
if you've got a pronoun and you tell me that's your pronoun, I'll call you. No problem. But it is interesting because this group, their whole ideology is going around the same. You're not a Muslim, we'll kill you. You're not a Muslim. That is what takfiri is. To issue takfir on someone is to denounce them. Yeah. So the idea that you'd give this guy a pronoun whose group denounces different groups and thinks that Yazidi women are, are legitimate slaves according to a misinterpretation of the holy books. That's what's fascinating.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating.
And then a few days ago, there was that article saying that they've now become a diverse,
inclusive
group.
So,
I mean, where's the regulatory bodies on this type of stuff? Do you know what I mean?
Someone should do something.
Someone should.
That's crazy.
It's just like, Anyway, that was a question, so I'll let you answer. What do you think about all of this, the coverage?
It's not surprising at all, because like we mentioned earlier, this guy is clearly doing something that is to the interests of the West, to topple Assad and open up the whole place to Zionism and hegemon to do whatever it wants. And so he has to be presented to the masses as this guy who is inclusive and he is tolerant, he's progressive, he has a vision for democracy, and everyone will feel safe in Syria. Actually, I saw something about a BBC correspondent saying that this is the first time he feels safe in Syria. And I wish we can go back 10, 5, 6, 7 years ago at the height of the civil war in Syria. And the same guys were describing the head choppers and how the place was messed up. And suddenly the guys have made the place safe. And this also speaks to the fact that the West is in decline. And we have people like Macron who just lost a no confidence vote. I mean, his prime minister lost a no confidence vote a week ago. And these are the guys who have really wanted to keep the north of Africa to themselves. So the AES guys have to look at this and say they will not allow any whitewashing of people who want to bring democracy to the place just because the West describes them as progressive, liberal, forward thinking.
Just a quick question with regard to that, basically trying to phrase the HTS as this very inclusive group right now. Who is the performance for? Is it the Western populations? Is it the Syrians? Because who's going to believe this?
I think it's mostly for their home audience, the Western population, just so that they
Basically
can justify
supporting
him.
Okay.
And people have quipped them. If that's the case, then all the Syrian refugees in Europe should then go back home because
It's safe.
the place is safe. So it's really complex. And like you said, there are many lessons to take out of it. Like we really have to be aware of how the West presents this whole thing.
Well, someone's put in the comments, guys, focus on your continent of Africa. You know, people are killing black migrants in Africa. Focus on that. The thing I'd say in response to that is all these things are interrelated. I remember in 2011, people were saying, that's North Africa. They don't care about us. Why should we care about them? Not understanding that it has a knock-on effect. The 2011 NATO operation in Libya is what has led to the mess in the AES. They gave weapons to every Tom, Dick, and Harry in Libya to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. Those weapons then went on the black market and not only destabilized the AES and Sahel and Libya, but it also destabilized the UK. The Manchester bombing was a young Libyan guy whose father was a general of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, who had been back and forth between Libya, assisted by the British Home Office to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, had made some trips to Syria, and then had become radicalized, went to a concert full of little girls and blew himself up and took many people out with him. They never thought that what would happen in Libya would have a direct effect in Manchester. Having an armed terrorist group take over a nation will make everyone more insecure.
And don't forget the slave markets and the migration crisis to Europe
Exactly.
through Libya,
exactly, which has
hundreds
led
of
to the
Africans.
rise of far-right movements. It's so funny. It's led, we've had a so-called migration crisis. I think people should be able to travel wherever they want. I don't think it's a crisis in that sense. But a so-called migration crisis caused by them destabilizing our parts of the world. And then it leads to far-right groups in the West, not talking about the foreign policy, and just demonizing migrants. So all of these things are interconnected.
And now we have far-right groups gaining popularity in Europe, far-right parties actually almost coming to power. And the whole genie out of the bottle thing is coming back to haunt them.
Yeah.
And there's like in terms of crisis like this in Europe because of the migration crisis, then we have extremist parties
AFD
now easily coming into power. because they're anti-immigration and all that kind of stuff.
Never talk about the source of the immigrants.
Of course,
Yeah,
of course.
but, yeah.
Yeah, and for example, we had in Romania we had this guy who I think was winning the election pretty much. He's anti-immigration, anti the Ukraine war, and the country cancelled the elections because they didn't want him to win.
Mm.
Because now the far right is actually gaining the upper hand. But the original source of the problem is them destabilizing places like Libya, and then now causing a flood of people to go there. Then their own citizens now becoming really intolerant. They don't want migration anymore.
Yeah.
But my critique, sorry.
So let me jump in just before I forget. And that also led to the Sudan war. So the European Union, because of the migration problem following the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, they sponsored Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, aka Hemeti, the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, knowing that he was a bloodthirsty warlord, understanding that actually this is precisely the guy that we need to police
Yeah.
the gateway to Europe.
Mm.
So they gave him funding, material support, allowed him to grow his militia force to a point where the militia force felt like it could take on the army. And here we are, according to US Special Envoy, over 150,000 dead in Sudan, over 60,000 dead just in Khartoum state, the world's worst humanitarian crisis. So all these things are interlinked.
And conveniently forgetting the Darfur genocide. Really,
Yeah, of course.
2003.
Of
Just
course.
just the same thing. Just whitewashing, cleaning up the guy, and using him to achieve your aims.
Yeah. Forget about the hell, death, and destruction that he's caused in our part of the world.
It's so long as it's black people who are dying over there, that doesn't concern us.
Yeah.
And I think even for the Europeans or for the West generally, like I feel if you maybe speak to Americans, they understand that war isn't good. On a very superficial level, they'll say stuff like, "Yeah, I mean, it was good we got out of Afghanistan. We shouldn't have gone to Iraq." Sure. But when it comes to actual foreign policy, I don't think it goes as far as that, because if that's the case, then they won't elect warmonger candidates, for example. They won't just outright shift every single excuse they have for why their countries are not going according to plan. They won't just pin it all on migrants. So I think on top of whatever they have, there's also a bit of dishonesty. They can't really face the true cause or why they're doing what they're doing. Yeah.
Before I
But
forget,
sorry.
you mentioned earlier about the head of al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, and maybe you want to tell us more about the
sure.
blowback from that.
Sure. So he was interviewed on France 24 as if he's just some legitimate political leader. He was talking about, what was going on in the Sahel. And he also gave assurances that France is not their target. He's focused on Africa, which I'm sure relieved the interviewer. And obviously that led to Mali, the revolutionary government in Mali, kicking out France 24. And then similar things happen in Burkina Faso, similar things happen in Niger. But then what happens is these fake NGOs that are just fresh press freedoms then use that to then rank Mali, Burkina Faso as having no press freedom, as if they would ever allow it.
Bin Laden
or in the West, or even Salman Abedi's brother is currently serving, I think, 35 years for his support of his brother in the no one's interviewing him. One at all is interviewing him in the West.
So why the exception? Basically?
Why is the exception?
Yeah.
And then Inam could talk about this. Then they put out fake stories about places like Burkina Faso, about so-called massacres that don't happen. And it's just spread everywhere. And most of these places that are reporting this are not even in the country. So we can blame, the Western public, but I feel like it's very difficult for them to actually get a hold of what's going on when this is the media that is meant to be informing them. So again, I'll go to Inam in a second about this, but in Niger, most Americans had no idea that there was any American presence in Niger until I think, was it 4 of them?
Yeah, getting
Yeah.
killed in 2017.
Yeah, and then they were like, "Oh, what we're doing in Niger?"
Yeah.
So the Western mainstream media doesn't inform the public at all about the nature of a Julani, about what's the American presence abroad, about what's going on in Burkina Faso, or why they would kick out France 24. Doesn't tell them at all. It just says these
There's no
military
press
dictatorships.
Shutting
They don't
down
let the
press
media-
freedom.
Yeah,
no
just
press
kicking
freedom.
out journalists.
Yes, yeah.
Just kicking out journalists. And then it comes to a presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And Kamala Harris can just lie and say, we have no active personnel anywhere in the world right now. Luckily, because of social media, the American soldiers were like, "What the hell are we
where the
doing
fuck
here?"
are yeah.
So Inam, I'll put it over to you. Do you think, you're someone that's lived in the US and now you live in Burkina Faso? There's a huge disconnect between what American public in places like the US know about what's going on with their military abroad, with supporting these terrorist groups, why a Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger would kick out Western media. Do you think there's a complete disconnect there?
Well, I just want to point out that France 24 was banned or censored in the Sahel for interviewing terrorists, people representing or leading in terrorist organizations such as al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb. African Stream is banned and censored because we interviewed civilians in grassroots organizations, on the streets of Ouagadougou and Niamey. So I think we shouldn't let this hypocrisy escape us as we're talking about Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger being low ranked for their liberty of expression or press freedoms and this and that. I mean, we're probably going to post this on Rumble, at some point, because we can't even have access to our YouTube channel to say these things. And who are we interviewing other than just my neighbors? So I think we should point that out as well. But no, I mean, I think it's a really important point. I think that a lot of what the United States policy has been counting on is the fact that, to be honest, a lot of people in the United States don't even really know that Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali exist. I mean, when I go back to the US and I talk to people and they ask me, where do I live? A lot of people are like, Burkina Faso, what is that? I've never heard of that country before. And I think that African Stream has really challenged and pushed people to realize that, there's something happening in this part of the world that otherwise they would be completely unaware of. If you do hear anything about the 3 countries of the Sahel, it's only, uncontextualized endless violence, but very little about any sort of popularly supported revolution, grassroots being integrated into supporting these leaders and the decisions that they're making. You don't hear that narrative at all. It's extremely limited what we have access to. I was also going to say, there's a parallel with Syria in terms of how much. I mean, this is just, Western politics 101, but they just love divide and rule, any sort of tactic that they could use to divide people, balkanize people. And I just think about it, some of the first people that raised an eyebrow for appearing on France 24 and being accepted onto their page, which is back in 2012, were people who were part of the separatist movement for Azawad in northern Mali, who were pretty quickly legitimized on France 24 and, invited when they started to break away back during that time period. They were brought on the France 24 platform. And I just think there's something that's interesting there. There's something that's also interesting with the way Syria is talked about. Instead of there being any sort of respect for Syria as a nation, it's like all this this undying love for the various different groups in Syria that need to break away. The same thing in Mali, same thing even in China, where you think about the crying about oppression. And it's you think about the hypocrisy. Are we supposed to believe that France has some sort of deep affinity and love and protection for minority groups or ethnic minority communities? Because that's not how they act within their own countries. The same thing with the US. Are we supposed to believe that the United States all of a sudden is like a beacon of support for minority groups within different countries? Because look at how they treat their own people internal to their own borders, who are not part of the racial majority or the ethnic majority. So I think, I don't know, there's just a lot of ways that this divide and conquer strategy that I see there and here are very similar. I think it's a way of leading to confusion, but I can say definitively, living within the AES, which is an ethnically diverse region, it's a religiously diverse region. It's there's people of all ages, all backgrounds. People overwhelmingly across these ethnic lines do support the three leaders. It's not, that's the strategy of the media a lot of the time, is to say this ethnic group or this ethnic group doesn't. Maybe this is something that we have to do in terms of work of just talking to people who are supposed to be part of these groups that hate the AES leaders, and asking them critical questions, because it's not what the media reports. But yeah, there's just a lot of false narrative. And then just one final thing, all these massacres that are allegedly happening with the AES militaries, I think it's so interesting that you never see any civilians in the AES pouring out into the street, denouncing or decrying these massacres. But overwhelmingly, I can point to examples where people have come out to the streets in the hundreds, if not the thousands, saying, stop the media lies, stop pushing this narrative. When the Human Rights Watch published a report saying that Burkina Faso was committing human rights violations and killing civilians, there was no protest saying, stop the killings. There was a massive protest in front of the U.S. Embassy saying, stop these lies. We know that you're, using the Human Rights Watch report as a justification to put out statements. We disagree with the narrative. They said that, we'll chase you out of the country if you push this narrative. That was what the mobilizations were looking like, not the other way around. So I think that needs to be highlighted as well.
Definitely. The diversity of the Sahel is quite interesting. I was going to ask you, that was going to be my follow-up question. What they used in Syria is the sectarian playbook. They really, really played on the sectarian playbook, pushed by the mainstream media, pushed by these Gulf states, this idea that these Alawites are ruling over Sunni Muslims. And some would go further, denouncing the Alawites as non-Muslims, as Shia this and Shia that, or the Shia takeover of al-Sham. And they really played the sectarian role, and they played it to a T. I'm not going to say credit where credit's due, because it's evil. But is there any dimension like that in the Sahel that we need to be wary of from now, that the imperialists might use to divide us amongst each other?
I mean, off the bat, the Azawad question, I think, is the most obvious one. I want to be very clear that when we talk about this struggle for, Tuareg separatism from the rest of the Sahel, that's something that predates the AES. This is not something where it's like Azawad emerged because they feel like the AES is oppressing them. This is something that has been before the AES existed. Like you mentioned, there's aspects of this that are tied to the destabilization of Libya. I won't lie, there's also aspects of this question that go back a bit further. Modibo Keita had to struggle around how to best integrate, the Tuareg people into the Malian state. There's aspects of this that are tied to colonialism, because the French were very, very big on pushing this sort of narrative of, there being separate races in Africa, and then they're racialized differently, which means that they're different people with different sort of, some groups might be superior to others. It's a colonial era issue, but it does exist. I want to point out as well that the people in northern Mali who are also struggling against the Aswad separatist movement in favor of the AES are also Tuareg people. Overwhelmingly, if you look at the Malian armed forces who are involved, those are Tuaregs who are on the AES side. So I don't think we should see this as just, some sort of issue where, all of the Tuareg people necessarily want to split. But there's a certain colonial legacy that's fed into some of this history that is playing up right now. And then the other thing is there's the narrative that's heavily pushed in Western media that, the war against terrorism in the Sahel that is being waged is a war against the Fulani people. That is such a dangerous narrative. I can say that overwhelmingly the Fulani people that I interact with, and I have interacted with, are very favorable to the AES. In Niger, in Mali, in Burkina Faso. But there's this big push to say that the Fulani people are being targeted and oppressed. And the reality is, most of the terrorists, and I'm trying to be very careful about how I explain this, but most of the terrorist attacks that have happened in their communities. So a lot of the war front is in areas where there's a large Fulani presence. But the people who are suffering at the hands of the terrorist attacks are Fulani people themselves. So when we're talking about victories in terms of, reclaiming land from the strongholds that have, and when I say terrorists, I'm talking about, of course, these allegedly Western-backed proxy forces. I say allegedly to be careful, but everybody here believes this. Everybody around me, I'm not saying everybody in a definitive way. I'm saying it metaphorically. But, the vast majority of people around me believe that these are Western-backed, forces. They're the ones that are controlling their territories. So that when we're talking about liberating these zones, it's Fulani people who are going to ultimately benefit from it. First and foremost, because they're being scattered from their lands. They also benefit first and foremost from the integration of the AES, because parts of their community are still nomadic. And so they benefit tremendously from having an integrated region where the borders are working to be eliminated. Like I said, pretty much all of the Fulani people I've interacted with support the AES, contrary to what Al Jazeera says, contrary to what the BBC says. And then also, the shining model of like what the AES is aspiring to and who the AES looks up to is Thomas Sankara, who is of a mixed Fulani background. So this is somebody who himself is of partial Fulani origin. So there's a lot of this kind of narrative. That's what the Western media wants us to believe in terms of sectarianism. They want us to believe that all Tuareg people are against the AES and all Fulani people are against the AES. And that is not at all what I personally have witnessed living in the region.
Thank you. Very interesting. Yeah, one of the Tuareg rebellion started in 2012, but a Tuareg town was ethnically cleansed by the NATO-backed forces in Libya in 2011. So again, it's linked. The idea, you could argue justifiably, even though I disagree with it, because I think very much like in South Sudan, we need to unite, not separate. But the idea that you need to separate came from a racist pogrom against people of darker hue that happened in Libya, again based on Western media lies that said that all dark-skinned people there were bought by Gaddafi to fight, not ignoring the fact that firstly around a third of Libyans are dark-skinned. Secondly, that many Libyans came because Libya is quite a sparsely populated population for the size of the country. A lot of Libyans came many years before just to work, and they ran with it. Any final thoughts before we conclude, William?
Yeah, I think I'll just take on Inem's last point about divide and conquer. There've been very few weapons wielded by the colonizer as much as that divide and conquer. If they didn't divide Africans in the beginning, in the 1400s, 1600s, they never would have gotten the continent. And your question was basically, how should we look at it from so as to prevent getting into its pitfalls? And I remember when Kidal fell to the Malian armed forces, when the people were celebrating, I remember seeing this very Tuareg general, and my initial thought was, yeah, this is perfect. The best propaganda against people who want to convince you that the Malian military is killing Tuareg people is having a Tuareg general liberate his own town. Same thing with what Burkina Faso is doing in terms of maybe the VDP, Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland. I'm sure they don't just go and pick from a particular subset of the country and block out the others. It has to be a cumulative effort. It has to be a collective effort. So for me, I feel with regard to divide and conquer, I think it's a very powerful weapon, and the best way to mitigate it is to just first of all realize that there's the risk. If we don't look at it properly, the colonizer, the imperialist, will always take advantage of that. That will always be, I think, probably step one before they even do anything else. So there's enough for us to go around. I don't really see a reason for us to maybe hate each other. We are different, sure, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't work together. Africa is the richest continent, 67% of the world's arable land. There's, if we wanted to, we will not starve. So yeah, I think the foundation definitely is that unity of purpose, basically. Yeah.
I like that.
Mm.
I like that because diversity, if we want it to be, could be our greatest strength.
Yes.
Or if we could become our greatest weakness.
Yes. Yeah.
Unless
Yeah.
we unite the people from all these different backgrounds. Kenneth, any final words?
Yeah, we started the discussion with events or developments in the Levant and what we can learn from that. And we've been saying this, that after they are done with that part of the world, they're coming to Africa. Africa is the next frontier in the global war against unity. And this is actually, Africa is the future. Just picking up from William's point, this is the world's youngest continent. We have all the resources we need. We don't need anything from anyone. And the AES is a prototype of what Africa can and will be in the coming years. And so the globalists and the imperialists and all the rest of them, they are looking at the AES, and obviously they are not sleeping on the job. When they're done with Syria and Lebanon and Palestine, they will come here and they will try and disrupt the trajectory that the AES is trying to show us we must be on. So we have to be very careful and protect the project and give it all the support it needs. As African Stream, we're doing our best. Right now, we have the fog of war being very thick in Syria, in wherever, and we are trying to present the facts and the reality in a very clear way so that people can see where we should direct our efforts.
Yeah, very wise words. I'm going to leave the final words to Inam. Inam, I've just got one final question. It's something that you said earlier that I thought was interesting. You said the AES, it's 3 states, but it's surrounded by a bunch of neo-colonial states. So even though it's probably the most unity we've seen in a long time, in some ways the unity of the neo-colonial,
it's strong as well, the strongest it's been.
Yeah. So is there any prospects of extending AES membership? Is there any states that you think have the potential to join the alliance?
Okay, so I'll answer that. And if I can, I also want to add some stuff about how the AES handles some of these questions of internal diversity a little bit more, because there's some things that I didn't mention, and I think the AES is a great model for the entire world, actually. On your question, the AES has always made it clear that other states are welcome to join, as long as they are, states that are pushing for greater sovereignty and have this vision of Pan-African unity. I hesitate still to name specific states. I know there's a lot of like excitement around states that are making moves that are similar to the AES. I feel like we really need to make sure that the leaders that are in place in those states, though, are leaders that are genuinely for the people. And so I don't necessarily know, like, as of now, which states might join. I'll be honest. For example, Chad has made the moves to expel the French military. Because of the history of Mohamed Debi's, family ties to France, I'm a little cautious in terms of whether or not I would want like Chad to join right away, just because I don't want it to be a situation where somebody like Blaise Compaoré has joined the AES, who might change his position if there's a certain offer somewhere else, or the CIA knocks on the door. So there's a little bit of like hesitation from me on that end, just because of who the leader is, because he has a very, very long family history tied to the French neo-colonial project. Senegal is another country that I think has potential. I still feel like, I hope that that Diomaye Faye is totally on board with the AES project. It feels a little bit still like he wants to kind of do this unification between ECOWAS and the AES, and could the sides come together? And I don't necessarily know if that's what the AES wants in the way that he wants it. So I think those 2 states are like the countries that people are looking at the most. And I think that it would be interesting to see whether or not they're totally in line, whether or not there's so much pressure on them right now that, you know, maybe they're making moves that otherwise they're wouldn't have been totally on board with. And I think there's this country that's been really ignored that also should be part of this question or this conversation, which is the Central African Republic, which actually has expelled the French military forces since 2022, the same year that Mali did, and is working a lot with Russia. I think it's a bit of a question mark as to whether or not you know, the leadership there might be totally on that AES wavelength. But I think, you know, any country that is and that genuinely is for self-determination and sovereignty should be welcome to the AES project. Yeah, that was a kind of a long response. I don't know if there is time to talk about some of the.
Yeah, sure. You're going to talk about the diversity and how the rest of the world can learn from it.
I think, you know, any part of the world that has, you know, is multi-ethnic or has any sort of difference, the imperialist forces are always going to try to exploit that. But I think with that being said, I think the Sahel is really an international model for how to work towards greater integration. I'll remind people that the word Burkina Faso comes from two different languages. Burkina comes from the More language, which is one of the largest languages spoken, meaning integrity. Faso comes from the Jola or Bambara language, which is spoken across Burkina Faso and Mali, meaning the homeland. Burkina Bay means, so Burkina, like I said, comes from the More language. Bay comes from the Fulani language, meaning person. So the entire basis or like foundation of Burkina Faso's identity is based off of this idea of like integration between the different ethnic groups. I mean, I am of a Nigerian background. I love Nigeria, you know, my country, but I'll say I think we have a lot of work internally to do before we get to a point where we have as strong of a cohesive national identity as I see in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, where it's not even a conflict, you know, that certain languages are used to be like the signifier of the national group. Like that is not an issue here. Everybody's Burkina Bay. Everybody's so proud to proclaim themselves a Burkina Bay. I think that the way these three states handle religious differences is also it's exemplar. For example, Burkina Faso is about 60% Muslim and then 40% divided between Christians and animists. If you looked at the previous Burkina Faso government, Ibrahim Traoré, the president, is a Muslim. The prime minister, who was just changed, but either way this still holds, is Christian. And then for the longest time, for the first couple of years, the minister of state, who was one of the most popular ministers in the eyes of the people, was an animist. I mean, you don't see this in a lot of other African countries, but openly so. In Niger, every single time there's a major event, whether it was the conference I just went to a couple weeks ago, or it was the big summit of the AES that founded the actual AES body, they bring out an imam and they bring out a Catholic priest and they pray together on the stage, on the podium. So there's this huge push both on an ethnic side and a religious side to have this sort of integration. Everything that the states work for, like if you listen to the national television, they're constantly talking about it. You know, we have our ethnic diversity, we have our religious diversity, we are one. This is part of who we are as a nation. They're like not afraid to adjust these things. So I think it's a good model. And even as we see that there are separatist groups and there's like these attempts to divide, I think we should also remember that there's no part of Africa, very few parts of Africa, and I'll say, and no part of the Sahel or West Africa that's ethnically homogenous. So if we're talking about Azawad people want their own land, there's no such thing as a Tuareg land that has never historically had Fulani people on it or Soninke people on it. There's no such thing as Fulani territory that doesn't have other groups on. Every single group as land is actually multi-ethnic, and that's just going back into history. So I have a lot to say. I'll leave it there, so I'm not speaking for too long.
Thank you.
We should keep supporting the AES.
Thank you, Inam. Yeah, I mean, Somalia is probably the only country I can think of that's relatively homogenous. They're all Sunni Muslim.
But there's also the Bantu.
There's also the Bantu. I was saying relatively, but the point I was trying to make is they're all part of the, apart from the Bantu, they're all part of the same ethnicity.
Yeah.
But then the imperialists divide them over clans. So it's not if you know, it's about uniting people
despite
any differences, because even if You guys are both from the Kikuyu tribe. They'll still find a way to divide you unless you are, united in purpose and united in, defense of the homeland. And we really feel for our brothers and sisters in Syria right now that they're looks like they're going to be led by a group that is extremely divisive, that is going to highlight and accentuate the difference between these groups and use them against different minority groups. So our thoughts go out to the people of Syria. Obviously, there is some good news coming out from Syria. I saw some heartwarming pictures of people returning to Aleppo and reuniting with family members. So there are some victories that will be had despite all of the chaos and all of the tragedy. But yeah, this is a very important episode, Pan-African Attitude. I hope you guys took something from it. I'd like to thank our co-hosts, and I'll end it as we always end. I've been Ahmed Kabela.
William Saka.
Kanoi Kaigwa.
Yeah, Richardson.
Until next time,
Peace.
peace.